People who have survived school shootings, what was it like? Serious. I was in the room when one student shot another at our high school, then ran out of the building. This was the 80s, so there was no lockdown procedure. We all just left the building in various states of shock. I never felt threatened, so it really didn't affect me too badly. The victim lived in the shooter spent several years in the Indiana Youth Center with Mike Tyson, and one of my best friends from high school. That's a bizarre sentence for you. Wait, was your friend the victim or the shooter? Sounds like his friend was not involved in the shooting, but was just in the same youth center as both the shooter and Mike Tyson. Coming up on the 9th anniversary of a shooting that took place at my high school when I was a senior, a student that had been suspended earlier in the day returned to the school with his dad's handgun, went into the office of the vice principal that had suspended him and opened fire. He struck and killed the vice principal and critically injured the head principal, who was responding to the sound of gunfire. The student fled the school and took his own life in a parking lot not far from the campus. I was in class at the time and an announcement came over the intercom that we were in a code red. Some students, teachers say they remember the announcement saying that it was not a drill, but I'm not really certain if that was included or not. My class locked the door, turned off the lights, and huddled in a corner, but I don't remember a feeling of fear or that the room was tense. We had had a couple of code yellows earlier in the year for small fights in the hallways, and code yellow red drills weren't uncommon, so the class felt more inconvenienced by the fact that we were just about to break for our lunch when the announcement was made than anything else. As we sat for longer without any update, a realization definitely began to come over the class that something more serious had happened, and we were all on our phones looking to get some idea of what was going on. This was before Twitter was super popular, and there was a ton of confusion and misinformation going around from texts that people were getting from other students in the building, and from family, friends who were now watching the story develop on the news. We eventually received word that the school was going to be taken out of the code red, and students, faculty would be released room by room and escorted out of the building by an armed police officer. We waited what felt like hours and finally received the knock on our door to indicate we were leaving. The officer walked us out the back of the school and through a parking lot that led to a church that neighbored the school. I met up with my parents and went home to watch my school on the news. Later that evening, I went to dinner with some friends to just spend time with one another, and we got word while we were there that our vice principal had passed from her injuries. We finished our meal in silence, paid our check, and went to the school for a candlelight vigil. There had to have been 400 plus people with candles and homemade signs, and people just took turns praying and speaking to the crowd. Nothing planned or officially organized, just an opportunity for people to hurt together. It sounds cliche when people say, "I never thought it would happen here," but that really is the only response that makes sense after something like that happens. I remember an intense sadness in the days that followed and cried more than I ever had before or since. When I think back about that day, I like to remember the kindness of the community at the candlelight vigil and the posters of support from neighboring schools that lined the main hallway of the building for the next month. Was this Millard South? Based on the description, yes. That was a scary day, and it wasn't even at West. I was around for Elliot Rodgers' shooting at UCSB. There are a few things that I remember being surprising. 1. The sense of humor. This was not everyone, but I remember a couple people making finger gun gestures at each other. I think this is because the event lasted a while and spread over the Isla Vista area, so there was a general discomfort wherever you were. I think people were coping with the stress however you could. Gallows humor, basically. The awkwardness of trying to console someone who just saw their friends shot or were shot at themselves. If you have ever been in a social situation where you didn't know what to say, add in the fact that whatever you say might permanently affect the life of the person you are talking to. Your school is now famous for this, although this was during a time that school shootings weren't super common, so that might be changing. I was working at Blaze Pizza when he shot up the deli. I was manager on duty. I was supposed to have a party that that night at my apartment when I got off work. I remember just turning off all the lights and getting people to the back of the building. I didn't know what to do besides hide. Our bosses tried to keep us working that night, but we all left and ended up sitting and drinking at my apartment anyway. No one wanted to be alone. Edit. Gauchos are strong, and I have never felt so much pride like I did in how we came together as a community for each other. I was at UCLA during the shooting in 2016. It was only a disgruntled grad student shooting his advisor and then himself, but we didn't know that at the time. Everyone was assuming it was a mass. I was walking back to my apartment just off campus when the notification went out that there were reports of gunshots and to get inside because campus was locking down. I finished walking home and turned on the news with some friends. I had other friends who were hiding in classrooms. The craziest part was the amount of misinformation going around on social media and in various group messages I was a part of. There were reports of more people shot and multiple shooters in a coordinated attack around various parts of campus and such. I'm not sure how much of that was fabricated maliciously and how much started with someone seeing the plainclothes officer with a gun or something and the story snowballing from there. I called my mom afterward and she started crying. She said she hadn't called me sooner because she didn't want my phone to ring in case I was in hiding. Honestly, really smart of your mom, monsieur. Everyone isn't as restrained or deliberated as that. There is a testimony from the trial of the terrorist after the Utoya mass shooting that is especially haunting in retrospect. The witness stood behind two others, who were shot and collapsed and pretended to be killed too. She was shot twice. After a while, when the terrorist moved away from the compound, she sat herself up and looked across the room at her lifeless friends to a chorus of ringing cell phones as the news of shots reached national media. I hope I'm not too late to get buried here. I was a first responder to Sandy Hook. I was a volunteer paramedic that worked 30+ miles from the school but was dispatched anyways, regardless of the distance and response time because we were up next once the local EMS crews were out of service. If I had to describe the scene, I'd say life-altering. I thought I had EMS stories to make your skin crawl before Sandy, but now I can't even come close. The screams of parents and teachers and other students are still burned into my mind. The visual scene. I couldn't close my eyes for weeks without seeing bodies. My short answer: you technically survived the shooting, but I'll never be the same. I think of myself as my name 2. My name 1-0 was pre-Sandy and 2-0 is after. I am a different person. I am still in weekly therapy and haven't made any drastic moves towards getting better. Even just seeing this question brought my stomach up to my throat. It's a part of me I'll never be able to explain to anyone that wasn't there, and I don't tell anyone that didn't know 1-0 me because it's too much to put on anyone. My thoughts are with anyone that was involved in a school shooting brave enough to post here. Peace be with you all. Thank you for being there and helping the victims. I was a student at Virginia Tech during the 2007 massacre. I wasn't directly in the fire or anything, just a student in the dorms. It was very surreal. That morning my friends and I sat in the dorms watching the news evolve on campus. It started off saying 1 or 2 injured. At that point we didn't make too much of the situation. I remember the newscaster saying at one point that the new updates was over 20 fatalities, and we all just froze. We assumed it was in error. It was not. As the day evolved we reached out to our friends to make sure they were okay, but cell service was very spotty. I had a very uneasy feeling that a somewhat peripheral friend of mine was in danger and tried to text her. It turns out she was shot. Another of our friends was shot and killed. The next few days were strange. Classes were cancelled and many left the campus. President Bush came to speak to us, but I'm sure even he felt helpless with not much to contribute. Eventually, they cancelled the remainder of classes and exams for the semester and we left for the year. The summer was difficult. At my summer job, people kept trying to talk to me about the shooting, both co-workers and customers. I don't know why, but I felt okay discussing it with fellow VT students but nobody else, including my other friends and family. I eventually quit that job and got a new one, not telling anyone I was a VT student. Returning to school felt surreal. We did a lot of school spirit activities at football games, but it was definitely a different atmosphere. I felt very uncomfortable in lecture halls, and whenever my mind went blank I imagined a shooter coming in and killing us. That feeling still persists sometimes. In large groups I'll start thinking about a mass murder occurring. That day, I'll always say, is the day I grew from a child to adult. I changed in ways both positive and negative. I made new bonds with my fellow classmates but felt isolated from some other people. It was definitely the defining experience of my young adulthood. For a long time, I didn't want to talk about these experiences with anyone. Now, I try and speak more openly about it because I am trying to advocate for a better future. I was an NRV resident at the time of the shooting, and went to a school less than an hour from Virginia Tech. As an adult I went to Virginia Tech, and honestly felt a little bad about missing the 10-year anniversary. While there, I actually was a classmate with an aerospace engineering student who was 30 years old. The reason was that he'd been 20 when the shooting had occurred, and due to the disruption of classes coupled with his own difficulties with the shootings, had decided to leave entirely. 10 years later he was getting back to it. As bad as it was for him, makes me feel good that he was able to contain his fear and not allow a terrorist to ruin his education. Here's to that 30-year-old student, hopefully doing well in his field. I was in the Arapahoe High School shooting in 2013. The kid got kicked off the speech and debate team and decided to get revenge on the teacher. He bought a shotgun and went into the school on Friday the 13th. He fired 2 shots right off my hallway and killed a girl. Then he went to the library, started a fire, and killed himself. I was in my science class right off the hallway. We were in the middle of a test and I just wanted out. I was about to ask to go to the bathroom when I decided I'll finish the test, then go home. 5 minutes later there was a gunshot. The first thing that crossed my mind was that a janitor was removing one of those giant wooden doors and accidentally dropped it, slapping it against the ground. Students looked back and forth nervously. Then a second shot went off. My teacher went out into the hallway, and a minute later returned to the room and told us to get into lockdown. I guess he saw the smoke in the stairwell and saw what happened in that hallway. Before long we were all crammed into the corners behind the big lab tables. I was sitting in the middle of the classroom, so I was one of the last kids to get to a spot. So I was basically sitting out in the middle of the room hiding behind a trash can. The whole time my teacher was upright right next to one of the 2 doors ready to up anyone that might walk in. We were in lockdown a good 3 minutes before the announcement even happened. We sat there for what felt like hours before the fire alarm went off. I'm assuming this was the fire started in the library, and even longer, and we began hearing voices down the hallway. My teacher looked right to me, in the middle of the room, with a nervous look in his eyes. Finally, cops, SWAT showed up. They tried the door and my teacher jumped and looked at me again, who was giving a violent nod and a thumbs up. They cleared the hallway before asking us to open the door. We all got pat down upon exiting, and sat out in the cold on the track field for a couple of hours before being bussed off to a local church. I remember texting my parents and sister that I loved them, and funnily enough I remember making jokes to my mom, cause I bet she was more scared than I was. For the rest of the month we had a long winter break. When we all got back things seemed really cool. Everyone was closer to each other and supportive. As the year went on things went back to normal, the usual bullying and other, so I went to online school. Ask any questions you have. Edit. Being in Colorado, where there was Columbine and Aurora, I now don't like going places with big crowds, especially protests or anything of the sort. Also, before you click this link, do me a favor and don't remember the shooter's name. Don't look at his picture. Don't give him that honor. He was troubled and I feel bad for Hi Monsieur. https://www.denverpost.com. The 14th of December 2013. Arapahoe High School shooting. Gunman intended to harm many at school. Edit 2. I remember afterwards while we were waiting to be bussed off, everyone was speculating who it was. They were speculating this one kid I knew and got along with pretty well. He was a weird kid but lots of fun. I remember thinking it was. All of a sudden everyone wasn't surprised it might be him because of the way he was treated. After school was back on, everyone was suddenly nice to this kid. They knew it was because they didn't want to be the next target. To the high school kids that might be reading this, you know that one quiet, awkward kid that sits in your class. Don't be nice to him because you're afraid of what he'll do if he snaps. Be nice to him because we all need that in our life. After all, we're all stuck on this rock hurtling through space. So just be pleasant to one another. Start a conversation. Ask about hobbies. Be a good person. Edit 3. Think of a person right now. Any person. Now send that person a text. How are you doing lately? Now listen to what they have to say and offer support. Be there for the people you know.